Some of the deepest wounds in life are not caused by betrayal, rejection, or loss. They are caused by the moment reality collides with illusion. A person trusted completely reveals a side that was never expected. Someone admired for their character falls short of the image built around them, and suddenly the pain feels far greater than the situation itself. Not because reality became harsher, but because the story believed about reality was stronger than the truth. Few experiences are more unsettling than realizing that much of human suffering begins not with what people do, but with what the mind quietly assumes about them. The Stoics understood this long before modern psychology existed. They taught that suffering often comes not from events themselves, but from the judgments attached to them. Human beings are complex, capable of wisdom and foolishness, kindness and selfishness, loyalty and weakness. Yet the mind resists complexity. It prefers certainty. It prefers clear answers. So it turns ordinary people into symbols, ideals, and expectations. The moment those expectations break, reality feels cruel. But reality did not change. The illusion did. And hidden inside that disappointment is something most people overlook: a rare opportunity to see more clearly. Because the day illusions begin to fall apart is often the day understanding begins. Not only about other people, but about ourselves. The assumptions we make, the stories we create, the expectations we quietly carry. Clarity can be uncomfortable at first, yet it remains the foundation of genuine freedom. And once that clarity arrives, it becomes impossible to see people and life the same way again. Most disappointments arrive long before the event that seems to cause them. They begin quietly, almost invisibly, in the private space of expectation. A person enters our lives, and without realizing it, we start adding details that were never actually there. We see a few admirable qualities and assume the rest of the character matches. We witness a moment of kindness and imagine a permanently kind person. We hear words that sound sincere and assume they are supported by equal levels of wisdom, loyalty, or maturity. None of this feels deliberate. It happens so naturally that we rarely notice it. The mind dislikes uncertainty. It prefers a complete picture, even when the available information is incomplete. So it fills in the gaps. It creates a version of reality that feels coherent and comforting. Then one day reality reveals a detail that does not fit the image we created, and suddenly what seemed stable begins to crack. This is why disappointment can feel so personal. On the surface, it appears that another person has failed us. They acted differently than expected. They made a choice we did not anticipate. They revealed a side of themselves that does not align with the image we carried. Yet, beneath that reaction is often something deeper. The pain is not only about what they did, it is also about the story that can no longer survive. A future imagined begins to dissolve. A belief carefully protected starts losing its foundation. The Stoics understood that emotional suffering often comes from confusing what is within our control with what is not. Another person's character, choices, emotions, and development belong to them. Yet many people build their peace on the assumption that these things will unfold according to their hopes. When reality refuses to cooperate, the result feels unfair. But reality was never obligated to follow expectations. This becomes especially clear in relationships. People often become attached not only to who someone is, but to who they might become. Potential can be incredibly persuasive. It invites the imagination to participate. A person may show glimpses of discipline, kindness, or emotional growth, and those glimpses become the foundation for a larger vision. Soon, the future version of that person becomes more emotionally significant than the present one. Attention shifts away from what is consistently demonstrated and toward what could eventually emerge. There is a certain comfort in this process because it allows hope to take center stage. Hope itself is not the problem. The difficulty begins when hope quietly transforms into expectation. What was once a possibility becomes something we believe should happen. Then the future arrives, and instead of becoming the person we imagined, they remain exactly where they are. The disappointment that follows can feel enormous because the loss exists not only in reality, but in imagination as well. Many people spend years carrying versions of others inside their minds that have little connection to who those people truly are. They interpret behavior generously when it supports the image and ignore evidence when it challenges it. Small warnings are explained away. Contradictions are minimized. Patterns are dismissed as temporary exceptions. This is not always because someone is naive. Often it is because acknowledging reality would require letting go of a comforting narrative. As Epictetus observed, men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them. Human beings naturally resist losses, and few losses feel more subtle than the loss of an expectation. There is no visible event to mourn. Nothing tangible disappears. Yet internally, something significant has changed. A possibility that once felt certain no longer exists. The mind must reorganize itself around a new understanding, and that process can be surprisingly painful. There is another reason people cling to expectations so tightly. Expectations often provide a sense of emotional security. Predictability feels safe. Believing that someone will always behave in a certain way creates the impression of stability. The mind relaxes when it thinks it knows what comes next. But life rarely offers that level of certainty. People change, circumstances change, emotions fluctuate, priorities shift. Even well-intentioned individuals sometimes act inconsistently. Expecting perfection from human beings is essentially expecting them to stop being human. The Stoic approach was never about becoming pessimistic or distrustful. It was about understanding reality deeply enough that disappointment loses its ability to dominate the mind. Acceptance does not mean lowering standards. It means refusing to build emotional stability on assumptions that cannot be guaranteed. Over time, a subtle shift begins to occur. Instead of asking whether people will become who we hope they become, we begin paying attention to who they consistently show themselves to be. Instead of investing all our energy in imagined futures, we learn to observe present realities. This does not make life colder. In many ways, it makes relationships more honest. Appreciation becomes rooted in what exists rather than what might someday exist. Respect becomes grounded in evidence rather than wishful thinking. Trust becomes something earned through repeated action rather than granted through imagined potential. And perhaps this is where genuine peace begins. Not when reality finally matches our expectations, but when our expectations become aligned with reality itself. If this reflection is helping you see people, relationships, and even yourself a little more clearly, consider subscribing. Wisdom rarely arrives through a single insight. It grows through repeated reflection. Perhaps the reason expectations become so powerful is that uncertainty feels uncomfortable. The human mind naturally searches for order. It wants clear answers, predictable outcomes, and stable conclusions. When it encounters complexity, it often tries to simplify it. People become labels. Situations become categories. Someone is trustworthy or untrustworthy, strong or weak, honest or dishonest. The mind finds relief in these distinctions because they create the feeling that reality is understandable and therefore manageable. Yet life rarely conforms to such neat divisions. The longer a person observes human behavior honestly, the more difficult it becomes to place anyone into a single category. Most individuals are mixtures of strengths and weaknesses, virtues and flaws, confidence and insecurity. The challenge is not that people are difficult to understand. The challenge is that they are often more complex than we want them to be. This complexity can feel frustrating because it forces us to live without complete certainty. A person may be generous in one season of life and self-centered in another. Someone may show remarkable courage under one circumstance and retreat into fear under a different one. Even the qualities people are most proud of can disappear when pressure increases. This does not necessarily make them dishonest. It makes them human. The Stoics understood that character is not a fixed monument standing untouched by circumstance. It is something that must be continually practiced and reinforced. A person may possess wisdom and still make foolish decisions. They may value honesty and still find themselves tempted by self-preservation. The existence of one quality does not erase the possibility of its opposite. Yet many disappointments occur because we unconsciously assume otherwise. Part of the difficulty comes from admiration. Admiration has a tendency to narrow perception. When people deeply respect someone, they often focus on the traits they appreciate while ignoring everything else. A kind person becomes kindness itself. A disciplined person becomes a symbol of discipline. A confident individual becomes the embodiment of certainty. The image grows larger than the reality. What began as appreciation slowly becomes idealization. The mind selects certain details and builds an identity around them. The rest fades into the background. As Carl Jung observed, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. In many cases, idealization becomes one more way of avoiding reality. Then, when an overlooked trait eventually reveals itself, the reaction feels disproportionate. The disappointment appears sudden, but in truth, the information was often present all along. It simply existed outside the version of reality that had been accepted. This can happen in friendships, relationships, workplaces, and even with public figures. People frequently project consistency onto those they admire. They assume that because someone possesses one admirable quality, they must possess several others as well. A person who communicates well is assumed to be emotionally mature. A person who appears calm is assumed to have mastered their emotions. A person who demonstrates confidence is assumed to be free from doubt. Yet these assumptions often say more about the observer than the person being observed. The mind fills empty spaces with conclusions because uncertainty feels incomplete. Instead of accepting that there are aspects of another person we do not fully understand, we create answers. Those answers provide comfort for a time. Eventually, reality begins supplying its own. When that happens, many people feel betrayed by the contradiction they discover. The patient person becomes impatient. The supportive friend becomes distant. The reliable colleague becomes inconsistent. Suddenly, the image fractures. Yet the contradiction existed long before it was noticed. Human beings have always carried competing impulses within them. Strength exists beside weakness. Confidence exists beside fear. Generosity exists beside self-interest. The Stoics never viewed this as a flaw unique to certain individuals. They saw it as part of the human condition itself. Every person is engaged in an ongoing struggle between competing tendencies. Some manage those tendencies more effectively than others, but nobody escapes them entirely. Recognizing this can change the way disappointments are interpreted. Instead of seeing every contradiction as evidence that someone has become a different person, it becomes possible to see that multiple aspects of their character existed simultaneously. One side simply remained hidden until circumstances revealed it. Pressure has a way of exposing what comfort conceals. Stress reveals weaknesses. Success reveals character. Loss reveals priorities. Time reveals patterns. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. Under pressure, people often reveal not who they suddenly become, but who they have been all along beneath the surface. None of these experiences create entirely new qualities. They bring existing qualities into view. This perspective does not excuse harmful behavior, nor does it require lowering standards. It simply encourages a more realistic understanding of human nature. There is a certain freedom that comes from accepting this reality. Expectations become less rigid. perception becomes more balanced. Instead of searching for flawless people, attention shifts toward understanding people as they are. This allows appreciation without illusion. Someone can be admired without being idealized. They can be respected without being placed on a pedestal. Their strengths can be acknowledged without denying their weaknesses. In many ways, this creates healthier relationships because it removes the burden of perfection. Nobody is forced to maintain an impossible image. Perhaps this leads to a more important realization. The question is not why people sometimes disappoint us. Human beings have always been imperfect. The deeper question is why we expected them to be free from contradiction at all. Once that expectation begins to dissolve, a different kind of understanding emerges. One rooted not in fantasy or judgment, but in observation. And from that place, relationships become less about managing expectations and more about seeing clearly. Once a person begins paying attention to patterns instead of isolated moments, the way they see other people starts to change. At first, the shift is subtle. Nothing dramatic happens. There is no sudden revelation that transforms every relationship overnight. Instead, there is a gradual movement away from impressions and toward observation. Words still matter, but they no longer carry the same authority they once did. Promises become less persuasive than behavior. Intentions become less important than actions. What people repeatedly do begins to matter more than what they occasionally say. This change can feel uncomfortable because it removes many of the shortcuts the mind prefers to use. It is easier to trust a convincing explanation than to patiently observe a pattern. It is easier to believe a promise than to wait for evidence. Yet time has a way of revealing truths that appearances can temporarily conceal. The Stoics placed great importance on what people consistently practiced because they understood that character is not measured by isolated moments. Anyone can behave well under favorable conditions. Anyone can display patience when nothing is testing them. Anyone can appear generous when generosity requires little sacrifice. Character becomes visible when circumstances become difficult. It reveals itself in repetition. A person who repeatedly chooses honesty when dishonesty would be easier demonstrates something meaningful. A person who consistently accepts responsibility rather than shifting blame reveals a quality that cannot be faked forever. These patterns may not attract immediate attention because they develop slowly. Yet they often tell a more accurate story than dramatic gestures or impressive words ever could. This realization changes the way disappointments are interpreted. Instead of focusing on a single incident, attention naturally shifts toward broader trends. One mistake no longer defines a person. Neither does one admirable act. The focus moves toward consistency. Someone who occasionally forgets a commitment is different from someone who repeatedly breaks promises. Someone who loses their temper once under extreme stress is different from someone who consistently uses anger to control situations. The distinction matters because human beings are imperfect. Everyone has moments they regret. Everyone falls short at times. The challenge is learning to distinguish between isolated failures and recurring patterns. That distinction often determines whether perception is grounded in reality or shaped by emotion. As observation deepens, certain truths become difficult to ignore. The friend who only reaches out during moments of need begins to stand out. The person who constantly speaks about loyalty while repeatedly placing convenience above commitment becomes easier to understand. The individual who insists they value honesty but reacts defensively whenever confronted with uncomfortable truths reveals a contradiction through repetition. None of these insights emerge from a single conversation. They develop gradually through accumulated evidence. One moment may be dismissed. Several similar moments begin forming a pattern. Eventually, the pattern becomes impossible to overlook. The mind starts recognizing that behavior repeated over time often reveals priorities more clearly than words ever can. Yet this clarity brings with it an unexpected challenge. The more accurately a person sees others, the harder it becomes to avoid seeing themselves with the same level of honesty. Observation is not a skill that remains directed outward forever. Eventually, it turns inward. The same principles used to understand other people begin applying to personal behavior. Suddenly, it becomes difficult to judge others solely by their contradictions, because similar contradictions start appearing closer to home. The desire for recognition, the tendency to avoid discomfort, the habit of justifying certain behaviors while criticizing those same behaviors in someone else. These things often remain hidden until attention becomes more disciplined. The process can feel uncomfortable because most people prefer seeing themselves through the lens of their best moments. They remember times when they acted courageously, generously, or wisely. Yet, genuine understanding requires looking at recurring tendencies as well. What happens during stress? What habits emerge when no one is watching? What choices are made repeatedly despite knowing better? As Socrates famously observed, the unexamined life is not worth living. These questions are not designed to create guilt. They are designed to create awareness. Awareness is difficult to achieve when attention remains fixed on isolated examples that support a preferred narrative. Over time, a deeper understanding begins to emerge. Human beings are not defined by what they claim to value. They are gradually revealed through what they repeatedly practice. This applies to friendships, relationships, leadership, and personal development alike. Patterns matter because they expose what temporary appearances often hide. They show where discipline is genuine and where it is performative. They reveal whether values are principles or merely preferences. And perhaps most importantly, they encourage a more balanced view of both others and oneself. The clearer these patterns become, the less room there is for illusion. What remains is not cynicism or distrust, but a quieter form of understanding rooted in observation. And from that place, both judgment and admiration become more measured, because they are no longer built on assumptions, but on something far more reliable, evidence gathered over time. This is where the process becomes uncomfortable. The same mind that creates simplified stories about other people often creates simplified stories about itself. Most individuals carry an image of who they believe they are. That image is carefully maintained. It highlights strengths and minimizes weaknesses. It focuses on good intentions and overlooks inconvenient patterns. It remembers moments of generosity while forgetting moments of selfishness. It recalls times of courage while quietly pushing fear into the background. None of this is necessarily dishonest. Much of it happens automatically. The mind protects its preferred identity because certainty feels safer than contradiction. Yet reality rarely conforms to the stories people tell themselves. Just as others are more complex than they appear, the same is true within every individual. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. Despite possessing immense authority and influence, he spent much of his private writing reminding himself to remain vigilant toward his own weaknesses. He did not assume wisdom made him immune to error. He did not believe good intentions automatically produced good behavior. Instead, he recognized that self-deception often wears the mask of self-confidence. The qualities people criticize in others frequently exist within themselves in different forms. Pride may not look identical from one person to another. Neither does insecurity, resentment, envy, or the need for approval. Yet the underlying impulses often share more similarities than people are willing to admit. This realization creates a profound shift in perspective. Judgment begins to soften, not because standards disappear, but because understanding deepens. The person who constantly seeks validation becomes easier to understand when one recognizes their own desire for acceptance. The individual who reacts emotionally becomes less mysterious when one remembers moments when emotions overpowered reason. The colleague who struggles with criticism appears less flawed when one notices the instinct to defend personal mistakes. Suddenly, the distance between observer and observed becomes smaller. Human behavior no longer appears divided into categories of enlightened people and flawed people. Instead, it becomes a spectrum of shared struggles expressed in different ways. There is a certain humility that emerges from this awareness, not the kind that pretends weakness does not exist, but the kind that acknowledges it honestly. Many people spend years trying to preserve an image of themselves that feels admirable. They want to be seen as disciplined, wise, patient, or emotionally balanced. These qualities are valuable. The problem arises when attachment to the image becomes stronger than commitment to the truth. At that point, growth begins to slow. Improvement becomes difficult because admitting faults feels threatening. The ego starts protecting identity instead of pursuing understanding. Every weakness becomes something to hide rather than something to examine. The Stoics approached this differently. They understood that self-respect and self-awareness are not enemies. In fact, one often depends on the other. A person who cannot acknowledge their flaws becomes controlled by them. What remains unseen continues influencing behavior from the shadows. Impatience appears in conversations. Pride influences decisions. Fear shapes choices. The individual may not recognize these forces, but they remain active nonetheless. Awareness changes that relationship. The moment a pattern becomes visible, it can be addressed. The moment a weakness is acknowledged, it loses some of its power to operate unnoticed. As this perspective develops, strengths begin to look different as well. They remain valuable, but they are no longer worshipped. Discipline becomes something to practice rather than proof of superiority. Wisdom becomes something to pursue rather than something already possessed. Confidence becomes quieter because it is no longer dependent on appearing perfect. The individual becomes more grounded, less reactive, more willing to learn. The need to constantly validate a particular identity gradually weakens. This does not mean becoming harsh toward oneself. In many ways, the opposite occurs. Self-awareness often leads to greater compassion because it reveals how difficult it is to be human. Everyone carries contradictions. Everyone struggles with impulses they would rather not acknowledge. Everyone falls short of their own ideals at times. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Whenever you are about to find fault with someone, ask yourself the following question: what fault of mine most nearly resembles the one I am about to criticize?" Recognizing this reality creates patience, not the patience that excuses poor behavior, but the patience that understands growth is rarely immediate. Change requires attention, effort, and repetition. Over time, a deeper form of acceptance begins to emerge. Not acceptance of every behavior, but acceptance of reality as it exists in the present moment. Strengths can be appreciated without exaggeration. Weaknesses can be acknowledged without shame. The need to divide oneself into categories of success or failure starts to dissolve. What remains is something more stable, a clearer relationship with reality. And strangely, that clarity often feels lighter than perfection ever did, because the burden of maintaining an illusion has finally been set down. Acceptance is one of the most misunderstood ideas in human life. Many people hear the word and immediately associate it with surrender. They imagine someone lowering their standards, tolerating poor treatment, or abandoning the desire for something better. Yet that is not what acceptance means. True acceptance is not passive. It is not weakness disguised as wisdom. It is the willingness to see reality exactly as it is before deciding how to respond to it. Nothing more, nothing less. The difficulty is that most people spend far more energy resisting reality than understanding it. They argue with facts that already exist. They become emotionally attached to how things should be while remaining frustrated by how things actually are. This creates a constant internal conflict because reality never changes simply because it is rejected. The Stoics understood that clarity must come before action. A person cannot respond wisely to something they refuse to see accurately. Yet this happens every day. Someone ignores obvious signs that a relationship is unhealthy because accepting the truth feels painful. Another person continues expecting maturity from someone who repeatedly demonstrates immaturity. Others spend years hoping that consistency will suddenly appear where inconsistency has always existed. The problem is not hope itself. The problem begins when hope replaces observation. When expectations become more important than evidence, disappointment becomes almost inevitable. Reality continues speaking through behavior, while the mind remains attached to a different story. Eventually, a realization begins to emerge. It is both simple and profound. Other people are responsible for their choices, their values, their priorities, their development, their willingness to learn. No amount of concern can substitute for another person's commitment to growth. No amount of effort can permanently compensate for someone else's lack of responsibility. This realization can feel disappointing at first because it removes the illusion of control. Yet hidden within it is an unexpected sense of relief. Once responsibility is returned to where it belongs, a tremendous burden begins to lift. The constant pressure to manage another person's decisions slowly fades. This is where attention starts returning to something far more productive: personal conduct. Instead of obsessing over what another person should be doing, focus shifts toward what can actually be influenced. Choices become clearer, standards become more meaningful, boundaries become easier to establish. Emotional energy is no longer consumed by endless attempts to control circumstances beyond reach. There is a quiet strength in recognizing the difference between influence and control. One allows room for wisdom, the other often leads to frustration. The more clearly this distinction is understood, the less chaotic life begins to feel. As this perspective develops, other people's behavior starts carrying a different meaning. Their actions remain important, but they stop determining emotional stability in the same way. Inconsistency becomes information rather than devastation. A broken promise becomes something to evaluate rather than something that destroys inner peace. A display of selfishness becomes a piece of evidence rather than a personal attack. This does not mean becoming indifferent, it means becoming observant. Reality is allowed to reveal itself without immediate resistance. The mind stops demanding that every person align with personal expectations. Instead, it pays attention to what is actually happening. There is a subtle form of freedom hidden inside this approach. Many emotional struggles are intensified not by events themselves, but by the meaning assigned to them. When someone behaves poorly, people often interpret it as a reflection of their own worth. When someone withdraws, they assume they have failed. When someone disappoints them, they carry responsibility for the disappointment. Yet much of human behavior has very little to do with the people affected by it. It often reflects internal conflicts, unresolved fears, habits, priorities, and limitations that existed long before the interaction occurred. Recognizing this does not excuse harmful behavior. It simply places it in a more accurate context. The result is a calmer relationship with reality, not because reality becomes easier, but because resistance begins to weaken. Acceptance allows facts to remain facts without turning them into emotional battles. Someone who repeatedly ignores boundaries reveals valuable information. Someone who consistently demonstrates integrity reveals valuable information as well. In both cases, reality is communicating something useful. As Epictetus reminded his students, do not seek for things to happen as you wish, but wish for things to happen as they do happen, and your life will go smoothly. The challenge is learning to listen without allowing wishful thinking to distort the message. Observation becomes more important than assumption. Clarity becomes more valuable than comfort. Yet, there is another layer to this understanding that gradually reveals itself. Once expectations become more realistic and control is placed where it belongs, relationships begin to look different. The desire to reshape people starts fading. The need to idealize them weakens. Reality becomes easier to accept, both in others and within oneself. But if no one is perfect, if everyone carries strengths and weaknesses, wisdom and blind spots, then a deeper question naturally emerges. What does genuine connection look like when it is no longer built on fantasy, control, or unrealistic expectations? That question leads toward something far more meaningful than perfection ever could, because it shifts attention away from who people should be and toward who they truly are. Many people spend a large part of their lives searching for extraordinary people. They believe fulfillment depends on finding someone rare enough, wise enough, loyal enough, or emotionally evolved enough to finally eliminate disappointment. The search itself often feels reasonable. After all, everyone wants meaningful relationships. Everyone wants to feel understood. Yet hidden inside this pursuit is an assumption that quietly creates suffering. It is the belief that connection becomes stronger as imperfections disappear. The Stoics would likely challenge that idea. They understood that human beings are imperfect by nature, not because they are broken, but because they are human. They struggle with fears, doubts, contradictions, and limitations. Expecting perfection from others is no more realistic than expecting it from ourselves. The more honestly this reality is accepted, the more clearly genuine connection begins to reveal itself. For many people, relationships become exhausting because they are built on performance. There is a constant effort to maintain a certain image. Someone wants to appear strong even when they feel uncertain. Someone wants to appear confident even when they are overwhelmed. Someone wants to appear successful even when they feel lost. This tendency is understandable. Human beings naturally want acceptance. They want approval. They want reassurance that they belong. Yet the desire to be accepted often creates a strange paradox. The more energy spent managing appearances, the more difficult it becomes to feel genuinely known. Others may admire the image being presented, but the person behind that image often remains hidden. The result is a quiet sense of distance that can exist even in close relationships. This distance is rarely created by a lack of interaction. Many people speak constantly while revealing very little. Conversations happen, time is shared, experiences accumulate. Yet beneath the surface there remains an invisible barrier. The barrier is not always deception. Often it is fear. Fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear that certain weaknesses will make acceptance disappear. Because of this, people become skilled at showing only the parts of themselves they believe others will approve of. They edit their struggles, they soften their insecurities, they hide their doubts. Over time, the performance becomes so familiar that it can feel almost automatic. The irony is that people often become more approachable when they stop trying so hard to impress others. There is something naturally disarming about honesty, not dramatic honesty designed to attract attention, but quiet honesty rooted in self-acceptance. A person who can acknowledge uncertainty without embarrassment often appears more confident than someone constantly trying to prove certainty. A person who can admit mistakes without collapsing into shame often earns more respect than someone determined to appear flawless. Authenticity has a calming effect because it removes the tension created by constant performance. Others sense it, even when they cannot fully explain why. This is where a deeper understanding of connection begins to emerge. Genuine relationships are not built on the absence of flaws. They are built on the ability to see flaws clearly without allowing them to define the entire person. Everyone carries strengths and weaknesses at the same time. Everyone experiences moments of wisdom and moments of poor judgment. The challenge is learning to hold both realities simultaneously. Idealization prevents this because it only sees strengths. Cynicism prevents it because it only sees weaknesses. Real understanding requires something more balanced. It requires seeing the whole person rather than selecting only the parts that support a preferred narrative. The Stoics repeatedly encouraged people to engage with reality rather than fantasy. This principle applies to relationships as much as any other aspect of life. When illusions disappear, disappointment does not necessarily increase. In many cases, it decreases. Expectations become more realistic. Reactions become less extreme. Human imperfections stop feeling shocking because they are no longer being compared against impossible standards. This creates room for patience, not blind tolerance, but patience grounded in understanding, a recognition that growth is often slow, that people are works in progress, that mistakes do not automatically erase value. As this perspective develops, compassion begins taking on a different meaning. It is no longer based on seeing others as innocent or flawless. It is based on recognizing shared humanity. The same fears that influence one person often exist in another. The same desire for approval, the same struggle with uncertainty, the same tendency to fall short of personal ideals. Awareness of these realities softens judgment without removing accountability. It allows people to maintain standards while still understanding the complexity of human behavior. Perhaps this is what maturity actually looks like. Not becoming immune to disappointment, not expecting perfection from ourselves or others, not withdrawing from relationships in an attempt to avoid pain. Maturity is learning to see people clearly while remaining compassionate. It is recognizing imperfections without becoming consumed by them. It is accepting reality without surrendering to cynicism. The need for idealized versions of people begins to fade because reality becomes enough. And when that happens, connection stops depending on performance, approval, or illusion. It becomes something quieter, stronger, and far more enduring. Not because human beings become extraordinary, but because they are finally allowed to be human. Eventually, something begins to change. Not in other people, but in the way reality is experienced. The people around you remain just as complex as they have always been. They continue carrying contradictions, strengths, weaknesses, ambitions, insecurities, moments of wisdom, and moments of poor judgment. Human nature does not suddenly become simpler. If anything, the longer life is observed, the more complexity appears. Yet despite this complexity, a quiet stability begins to emerge. The constant need for certainty starts fading. The urge to categorize every person as either trustworthy or untrustworthy, admirable or disappointing, gradually loses its grip. There is less urgency to arrive at final conclusions, less pressure to define people completely. Instead, there is a growing willingness to observe, understand, and accept that some aspects of human behavior will always remain difficult to predict. This shift often feels subtle at first. The situations that once triggered intense emotional reactions no longer carry the same weight. Someone's inconsistency becomes easier to notice without immediately taking it personally. A disappointing interaction no longer feels like evidence that people cannot be trusted. Likewise, a positive experience no longer creates unrealistic expectations about the future. Reality begins to occupy the space between idealization and cynicism. As Aristotle observed, it is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. In a similar way, wisdom allows a person to observe both strengths and flaws without rushing toward blind admiration or distrust. There is something surprisingly peaceful about that middle ground. It removes the burden of constantly defending against disappointment while also freeing the mind from the exhausting task of maintaining unrealistic hopes. Many people spend years moving between these two extremes. They place someone on a pedestal only to later become deeply disappointed when reality fails to match the image. Then, in response to that disappointment, they swing in the opposite direction. They become guarded, suspicious, detached. They convince themselves that expecting the worst is a form of wisdom. Yet expecting the worst is no more accurate than expecting the best. Both are attempts to replace observation with assumption. Both are forms of certainty disguised as insight. The Stoics understood that wisdom requires a different approach. It requires the ability to remain grounded in reality without becoming controlled by either optimism or pessimism. This is why genuine maturity often looks calmer than people expect. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself loudly. It appears in small moments, in the ability to remain composed when someone reveals a flaw, in the willingness to adjust expectations when new information appears, in the refusal to turn every disappointment into a personal crisis. There is strength in that kind of stability, not because it eliminates pain, but because it prevents pain from becoming confusion. Human beings will still make mistakes. Relationships will still encounter challenges. Trust will still be tested. Yet these experiences stop feeling like violations of how life is supposed to work. They begin to feel like natural parts of the human experience. As this understanding deepens, compassion begins to develop in a different form. It is no longer based on unrealistic expectations or idealized views of people. It becomes rooted in realism, a recognition that everyone carries burdens invisible to others. Everyone has blind spots. Everyone struggles with something. This perspective does not remove accountability, nor does it require tolerating harmful behavior. Boundaries remain necessary. Standards remain important. The difference is that judgment becomes less reactive. There is less surprise when imperfections appear because imperfections are expected. Not celebrated, not excused, simply acknowledged. One of the most significant changes occurs in the relationship with personal worth. Many people unknowingly tie their sense of value to the reactions of others. They seek validation through approval, attention, admiration, or acceptance. When those things are present, they feel secure. When they disappear, self-doubt begins to emerge. Yet this creates a fragile foundation because it places inner stability in the hands of circumstances that cannot be controlled. The more clearly reality is understood, the less appealing this arrangement becomes. Gradually, self-worth becomes less dependent on external confirmation, not because approval stops feeling good, but because it is no longer treated as proof of value. This creates a different relationship with uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer feels like a threat that must be eliminated immediately. It becomes something that can be tolerated. Sometimes relationships will work. Sometimes they will not. Sometimes people will exceed expectations. Sometimes they will disappoint. Often they will do both. Life becomes easier to navigate when these possibilities are accepted rather than resisted. The need for guarantees begins to fade because guarantees were never available in the first place. What remains is a greater capacity to engage with reality as it unfolds. And perhaps that is where genuine peace begins, not in finding perfect people, not in creating a life free from disappointment, not in protecting oneself from every possible risk. Peace emerges from clarity, the ability to see people as they are without demanding they become something else, the ability to acknowledge flaws without becoming cynical, the ability to appreciate strengths without turning them into fantasies. There is freedom in that perspective because it removes the constant struggle between reality and expectation. In the end, people remain imperfect. They continue carrying contradictions, uncertainties, and limitations. Yet once the need for certainty disappears, those imperfections stop feeling threatening. They simply become part of the landscape of human life. And in that acceptance, something remarkable happens. The world becomes neither better nor worse than it was before. It simply becomes clearer. And clarity, more often than not, is the beginning of wisdom. The day you stop romanticizing people is not the day you lose faith in humanity. It is the day you begin seeing human beings clearly, imperfect, complicated, capable of both strength and weakness, just like yourself. And strangely, that clarity does not make life colder. It makes it more peaceful. Because when you stop asking people to be perfect, you finally free yourself to appreciate what is real. If this reflection resonated with you, take a moment to continue the journey. One of the videos on your screen right now explores another powerful Stoic lesson that can deepen your understanding of yourself, your relationships, and the way you move through life. Stay with that thought and keep going. Thank you for being part of Stoic Journal. Until next time, protect your peace, seek wisdom, and continue becoming stronger from within.